My brothers and sisters, the last 2 Sundays, the Gospels have presented stories encouraging us to be prepared for the coming of the Son of Man. In each story, everyone knew, first of all, that the Master would return from his journey, and secondly, that the bridegroom would arrive at the reception, no matter how long they may be delayed. What was expected of the servants? What was expected of those 10 virgins? Watchfulness, activity, preparedness. And as we know, some were and some were not. This Sunday of the Solemnity of Christ the King marks the end of the liturgical year, and it ends with a vision of glory, the glorious splendor of the coming of the Son of Man, escorted by his angels. The Gospel then presents to us the last act of history, Judgment Day. What a reversal there is between this scene at the end of time and the scene of Christ standing before worldly leaders, before King Herod, before Pontius Pilate, before the high priest. Then they were the ones who were seated, with Jesus standing in chains before them. Now, at the end of time, the nations of the world are standing before Christ, who is seated on his throne. This portrays the faith of the Church, the faith that we recite every time we come together on Sunday in the Creed. He will come again in glory to judge the living and the dead, and his kingdom shall have no end. The Son of Man is indeed the King of the universe. We know that from the prologue of John's Gospel, everything that came to be came through him. But Christ the King, the Son of Man, comes also to judge. What is his first action after he sits down on that royal throne, surrounded by his angels? He takes up the role of a shepherd. He is a judge who searches for the lost sheep. His concern is to save the sheep, to give them rest and pasture. As we heard in our responsorial psalm, "The Lord is my shepherd, there is nothing I shall want. Fresh and green are the pastures where he gives me repose." Christ reveals himself to us as a good shepherd, but one day he will be obliged to be our judge. And so as we journey through life, now is the time of mercy, but then at his second coming, it will be the time for justice. The shepherd king in our story today in the gospel divides the sheep of his flock from the goats. And notice how the division is made. Christ's judgment is based solely on love. Whatever you did for the least brothers of mine, you did for me. The Lord in this parable sets down only one requirement for entering his kingdom, and that requirement is love of neighbor. And who is my neighbor? We remember that famous question after one of the scholars of the law asked Jesus what was the greatest commandment. And he appended the second commandment, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus responds with the parable of the Good Samaritan. The Samaritan came upon a man lying on the road who had been beaten and robbed. He bound up his wounds, placed him on his own donkey, and took him to an inn where he paid for his lodging and his care. The Samaritan was a neighbor because he put aside his own travel plans in order to show compassion to a stranger. And yet, not only a stranger, but even more a brother in the human family. The Samaritan was indeed a citizen in the kingdom of Christ the King. The requirement that the king in today's parable establishes in order to be placed on his right with the sheep of his flock is love of neighbor. Why? Because you did it for me. How? Remember the Gospels of the 2 previous Sundays. We must be watchful, we must be vigilant, we must be active, we must be alert. That's how the Good Samaritan was. That's how the Good Samaritan lived. In that parable, we are told that he saw the injured man and was moved with compassion, and seeing, recognizing him, he then approaches the man lying there. Finally, he took action. He bandages the man's wound, and he accompanies him alongside his donkey to the inn and pays for his care. Seeing, encountering, and accompanying. Those are the building blocks of love in action. Now we too must pray for the willingness to encounter our neighbor who is in need. Of course, we can seek them out. There are many ways to do that. There's baby pantries, there's food shelters, there's kitchens, there's shelters, visiting people who live under the bridges. And we know people who go and do that. Some of them are here today. But we can also be open to engaging our neighbor in need when he or she unexpectedly appears and crosses our path. And this is the most gratifying response, I think, when we're not expecting it, and yet we can see who is in need. We are willing to approach them, to get near to them, and to accompany them in some way. Thankfully, the help that we can give are very, very simple things. What does Christ the King mention? Giving the hungry a meal, giving the thirsty something to drink, giving the strangers a welcome, the sick and imprisoned a visit. All within the reach of anyone's budget. My brothers and sisters, the final verse of the gospel brings us to that final separation of saints and sinners. The most important word in this verse, which is both dreadful and delightful, is the word eternal. The two states of the afterlife are perpetual. They are of unending duration. Ultimately, the road of human life will divide into two, one splitting off towards a punishment that never ceases, and the other toward life that never ceases, with Jesus in his kingdom. If we can recognize our King in others and encounter him in those especially who have need, then Jesus will surely say to us, "Come, you have my Father's blessing. Inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. Amen.